Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding the Impact Financial Disruptions to the Cultural Heritage Sector. A little bit about me before we dive in. I'm the founder and director of Relicura. I am Rachael Woody, founder and director. I have specialized in collections development and digital collections programs and have had 20 years in the archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations. A quick note on housekeeping. This particular webinar is recorded, so along with the recording link, we'll also send out any links that were mentioned in this particular slide deck. As this is a pre-recorded session, we do that to help deliver the maximum amount of information to you, while also being able to answer any sort of follow-up questions immediately within the chat if you are joining us in Premiere mode. Speaking of which, if you're with us in Premiere mode, please feel free to use the YouTube chat box to help share your questions or your own examples or resources as they pertain to the topic. And we are using the YouTube player and platform, so you have your typical access to the YouTube tools in terms of being able to use closed captioning and to expand or resize the screen. And then finally, please just remember to be respectful of content, whether it is my content or in some cases we're referencing other content, just being respectful of who created those. So let's get into it. The topic for today is multifaceted, complex, and in our current era of chaos and things changing daily, we're going to do our best to sort of dive in, provide some context, and provide information that is meaningful and helpful within the moment, as well as helpful and informative for any sort of moving forward. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about income streams, just a brief orientation in case you are new to the concept of income streams. We're then going to talk about the before times, which is recent statistics and data that was gathered in 2024, or some of it I think was end of 2023, but certainly reported on by 2024. Most of the data did come from the American Alliance of Museums, so it is museum-specific data. I wish we had other updated sort of information for archives and other cultural heritage organizations, but that info just does not exist currently. We'll then get into the different data streams and the disruptions we're seeing currently and sort of what is impacting it and what that means. So we'll talk about the earned income disruptions, charitable disruptions, government and investment disruptions. And then initially we weren't going to offer any sort of like, what do you do? Or, pragmatic solutions, which is typically for my brain a requirement in any sort of webinar we do, is like if there's a challenge or a problem, then you need to also come prepared with a solution. Because this is ever-changing and so complex and also very unpredictable, initially we were not going to offer that, but my brain refused, and so I did end up finding some things that I want to share with you all in terms of what we could possibly do, especially if we're the ones not necessarily in control as director or leadership level. So hopefully you find those helpful, at least to some extent. And then, of course, resources, the resources we cited, as well as any sort of resources that help with the particular topic. So with that said, let's get into income streams real quick for an orientation. If you are interested in learning more about income streams or want to have some more content around income streams and what that looks like for archives and museums, we do have a webinar that covers these in more depth, as well as how one could communicate value, especially from like collections management perspective, which is not necessarily direct revenue generating, it is usually indirect. This is the webinar for you. So you can take a deeper dive with what do we value, how do we measure it, to learn more. But the essential pieces are 4 separate income streams. First one is that earned income piece, so any sort of earned income coming into it. We'll get into some specifics in just a moment. Thinking about charitable income, which is often like the more often thought of in terms of like donations, sometimes grants. Third arm of that being government funding, so you can imagine why we're spending time talking about this today. And that fourth piece being income from investments. So for some museums and archives, this is just not even an income stream on the board, so to speak, in which case that's fine. Many of us don't have that as an income stream, but often medium to larger size organizations, investments, endowments, some sort of tie to the money market does impact the sort of funding that comes to that particular organization. So in terms of specifics for what this could look like for museums and to some extent archives and cultural heritage organizations, the earned income piece is often derived from attendance. So for museums, this is obvious with exhibit attendance. There's membership, which could be museum membership, as well as historical society or archives membership or subscriptions. There's also the retail aspect if your particular space has a retail sort of element to it, as well as any sort of special events that derive income, space rentals, things like that. For the charitable income side, that is basically grants and donors, and this is non-government grants in this case, since government grants have their whole other category. So we're thinking about private foundations, nonprofits, as well as your donors. This is more typical for being major income streams for those smaller to mid-size organizations. The third arm, that government funding piece, this is also where grants fall in if it's a municipally funded grant. So that means a grant that's coming from city, state, federal type funding. It could also, depending on your organization, you may have a bond or a levy in place, which is typically a ballot voted in by your community to have a portion of their taxes be allocated to your particular organization as a regularly occurring line item for typically a specific amount of time. And then in addition to or aside from bonds and levies, sometimes there are line items that are granted by your city, county, or state where a specific amount of funding has been assigned to your particular organization, perhaps because you help to caretake their collections or there's like a shared space agreement. There can be many permutations into what this looks like, but essentially it's money coming from a municipal government. And then that final piece, that income from investments. So we're talking about money market performance in terms of impact for today's discussion. But as I said earlier, this could include endowment impacts for those of you who do draw upon endowments. This impacts any sort of estate giving, especially if it's tied to sort of retirement funds or investment funds. It can be tied to, like, if your organization is large enough or for whatever reason is involved and has investments in the money market. So there can be a couple different permutations for why the market impacts your current financial health. So in order to understand the continued chaos currently happening, I think it's helpful for us to have an established benchmark from last year because things weren't amazing. Like, it wasn't springtime and roses in 2024. There were still some very present challenges. So I want us to look at those now as helpful context to how those have either stayed the same or evolved in 2025. So one of the main statistics reports that we're going to look at comes from the American Alliance of Museums 2024 annual snapshot. And this particular survey is administered to museum board leadership or about museum board leadership. So depending on the questions, either it's about the board or informed by the board. And while this may not seem directly relevant, some of the coverage that they do is very much related to our financial topics today. So bear with me as we dig into this one. Part of the snapshot included an income snapshot. So again, the name of it with leadership may be a little misleading. as it was a survey with leadership. And this particular income breakdown is from 2024. So prior to new presidency and everything that 2025 has brought, this was the average statistical breakdown. And again, it's for museums, though much can be extrapolated and applied to archives and cultural heritage. For the most part, we're seeing the earned income and charitable income brackets be roughly equal, so 30-ish%. We're seeing government funding being very close to that at 24%. And in fact, I believe this has risen from the previous leadership snapshot they did, which I think was right before COVID. So it's interesting that we're seeing an increase in that particular area of funding, and overall in 2024, seeing a somewhat equal spread across at least 3 different income streams, with investments, of course, being a little bit more niche and not as used. So keep these percentages in mind when we start talking about the disruptions and impact. One of the key findings of this particular report I found alarming. There was a number of key findings, of course, but this one seemed the most pertinent to our topic today. And that is number 6. The museum field continues to face financial strain, with half of museums indicating at least one sign of financial distress. So this is post-COVID, but pre-2025. We'll take a look at some other statistics that show we've not quite recovered from COVID, though many of us are finally getting back on track and healthier. But what this does indicate is that we are already in sort of a crisis mode, or a good majority of us are in crisis mode, financially speaking, before 2025 and everything has happened. So just keeping this in mind as we move into the next one. We're next going to take a look at the National Snapshot of Museums. So this is another American Alliance of Museums report, gathering statistics from this last year. And so this one presents sort of a broader snapshot than the leadership one, but sort of helps to build on some of the disruption that happened prior to 2025. So one of the main disruptions recorded in this particular snapshot report is the disruption of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI backlash. For those of you who keep up to date on the Trends Watch report that is also put out by AAM, DEI backlash was one of the major trends that they covered, and this is again came out before 2025. Many of us were already seeing quite a bit of that reported in our particular industry and field, so hopefully not much of a surprise to us today. However, it does show that there was impact already happening prior to 2025, and we can imagine that it has only broadened with the current climate. So at least 1/3, or 34%, of museums have reported experiencing some DEI backlash. And further sort of reporting here, 1 in 10% report donors withdrawing or threatening to withdraw funds. So we're seeing DEI as a program, while not itself necessarily impacting funding other than funding it may need, is impacting income in terms of perhaps alienating or turning off donors, for example, or perhaps negating eligibility for grant criteria. And then the other percentage here being 6% of museums reported being limited by legislation. And so this is legislation, at least in 2024, happening predominantly at the state level for outlawing or making illegal to at least some extent any sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion content or incorporation into programs that receive any sort of municipal funding. This is a statistic that we can only imagine has increased, regardless of what has happened in 2025. This was already on the rise with many legislation, suggested bills being working their way through state legislation to be passed. So it was a statistic we already knew that was going to go up, and most definitely so in the current climate. Further disruption forecasted. So this particular question I found really interesting given what we're going through now. They asked in 2024, what do you anticipate will be the biggest disruptions to your business strategy in 2025? So I've put little pink arrows next to the very specific ones to my mind that have most definitely been impacted in 2025. First and most predominant recorded in 2024 was shifts in philanthropy, so 48%. This was the top disruption forecast concern of the museums that were surveyed. And while shifts in philanthropy is a pretty broad and squishy sort of concept, I think we can agree, given current events, that absolutely we have seen significant shifts in philanthropy sort of in reaction to everything that is happening. The second and sort of second largest concern here is the financial market instability. This was measured at 46%. Part of this, I imagine, is the typical sort of anxiety when there is a new incoming president. Perhaps more so knowing that this particular president is known for causing some money market chaos. And that has absolutely proven to be the case. For example, tariffs alone have created market instability and chaos. So absolutely 46%, they were concerned last year. This absolutely has moved to like 100% is happening. The third one, reduction or elimination of government funding. Well, this one was only 33%, but has very much in just these first few months, 6 months already, I suppose, of 2025 has become 100%. Absolutely. Pretty much every federal funding pot that we typically have access to as a field has been paused, closed, is wrapped up in court cases, hasn't received fiscal year 25 funding, let alone is at risk of losing fiscal year 2026 funding. So it's across the board, government funding, 100% impacted. A couple of other areas that didn't rank quite as high for the museums that responded last year is ideological/political polarization. While that necessarily is not a direct funding impact, you can see how it impacts indirectly through examples like the DEI backlash and how that can impact the donors and grants that museums and organizations may be eligible for, as well as changes to travel and tourism. This particular one was 27% last year. And absolutely, between economic uncertainty for any sort of local in the United States travel, in addition to extreme reticence, understandably, of the international community planning to visit the United States, which is where a great amount of museum attendance tends to happen, is through the tourism sort of engine. We absolutely are seeing impact of that. This summer has only just started, so we don't have enough numbers just yet, but knowing that tourism has decreased significantly will of course mean that any sort of tourist-driven traffic and tourist-driven dollars to our organizations will also be impacted. So getting into the specific income streams and the disruptions, I want to list each of them so that we can better understand the different facets at play. So first, thinking about income and attendance. So this particular grid came from the snapshot from 2024, and this is the percentage one that shows sort of our comeback, so to speak, attendance-wise from the COVID-19 pandemic. This was specifically trying to compare the attendance from pre-COVID to now. So whether we're seeing back up to 100% of our attendance as of pre-COVID to now, which the fact that it took 5 years for most of us to get to back to 100% of what was 5 years ago numbers is a good number, but it's also concerning. It should not have taken half a decade. We would not have liked it to have taken half a decade to recover to pre-COVID numbers for our attendance. And then you'll also notice, of course, a good chunk of museums have not recovered to pre-pandemic numbers, and that of course has continued impact on their income, that earned income stream. So just giving a snapshot of this was 2024 numbers of where we're only just at 100% or still sort of lagging behind. And now, of course, we're experiencing a bit worse. So earned income disruptors. So a reminder that this includes attendance, membership, retail, and events. We're seeing tourism decline first and foremost, especially in these next few months. We're going to see the major impact of that sort of decline in numbers. We also have economic recession question mark. We are not officially, as of today, in what is officially termed as an economic recession for the United States. However, there is certainly economic uncertainty and people anticipating an economic recession, which of course impacts the decisions that consumers make, including things like going to the museum or visiting cultural heritage sites, even doing local tourism, staycation concepts. It's impacting all of those decisions. There's then the tariffs, which like another question mark, shrug emoji, like who knows, like it's impossible to keep track now or keep information even remotely up to date. But regardless, the threat of tariffs is having knock-on impact for the economy as well as tourism, which of course is cyclical, and is impacting the decisions for that earned income stream. And then finally, also supply chain uncertainty. So whether tariff-based or not, also just relationships with other countries where the supply chain may be in effect for those that have retail spaces especially, or for those that tend to do larger exhibition productions where sourcing materials is important. Having supply chain uncertainty means that the supplies that are available are going to be more expensive, which has impact on what is bought, how many, and then of course what is then not receiving money because of these unexpected, very large disruptions to expected budgets. So charitable income disruptions. Looking at the snapshot for donations for 2024, one of the questions was asking about, has the amount of money given to your museum by individual donors increased, decreased, stayed the same? So not necessarily looking at has the total donation amount increased or decreased, because that is a different but very interesting question where, as a side note, they're finding less people tend to give, but they are giving more, is the initial findings, I believe, from the center over at the AAM. But in terms of actual donor numbers, there is about a 19% decrease, which we never like to see a decrease, but given these 5 years since pandemic, and of course going into this next year, I imagine that's a percentage that is going to increase. About 4% was the not sure. The next largest, 32%, stayed about the same. To me, this is sort of a similar statistic to like we just finally made it back to 100% pre-pandemic numbers. Like, yes, it's a good thing, but also the fact that it took 5 years to get there means that we're still in such a deficit in terms of income and any sort of financial resiliency. And then 46% reporting that there was an increase, which is great. I would love to see some breakdowns in terms of the size or types of museums that are experiencing this increase. I suspect there are some trends here, which I'm sorry, resisting the rabbit hole. Anyway, a 46% is good. I wish it were more this next year. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be more challenging for us to see that number increase. All right, so charitable income moving into 2025 and forward, of course, tourism decline is going to impact grants and donors. I know quite a few cultural heritage grants, especially at the local level, tends to be funded by tourism dollars or tourism tax. So the fact that there's not as much tourism impacts this charitable income stream in addition to the earned income stream. It also means that there's a demand slash increased competition for the grants and donors that are available, because especially that federal funding and the drip down of like SHPOs and the grants through them, given that that has closed or paused or whatever for now, means that every other granting opportunity or donor is being hit that much harder. I'm seeing numbers that are like 10 times the amount of applications received this year compared to just last year. We also have money market uncertainty. So this tends to impact donors more so than grants, depending on how the grant is funded. But many donors, especially those of retirement age, tend to have a drawdown on funds that are tied to a money market. And if those investments have gone down, that means that there's less money to draw down upon, or perhaps a reticence to draw down upon that sort of funds. And also fun, 501c3 status threats. So depending on what the granting agency, for example, is wanting to fund, if that is in contradiction to what is currently being broadcast by the presidential office, we know that nonprofits have been threatened with their 501c3 status. So having that sort of threat also means that certain projects or programs are not as likely to be funded, and that is going to be a huge impact on our charitable income. Government funding disruptions. So hearkening back to the board leadership report, I want to bring up this report card now. And the report card was asking, how would you grade your board's performance in the following areas? And we could do a whole webinar on what's happening in this report card, but the two most alarming are the most applicable to our topic currently, and that is monitoring legislative and regulatory issues that have the potential to impact the organization. The museum directors assign the board a D+, the board members assign themselves a C+, still not great. And then also educating policymakers about the issues that have an impact on the organization. So again, directors graded the board D+, board members graded themselves C+. This is huge. There is challenges in general in working with boards, and the challenge for museum directors when they have board members who do not understand or not committed to the responsibilities of their office. A lot of it is like financial fiduciary responsibility, oversight that the board provides of the museum in this specific case, but of archives and cultural heritage organizations, certainly. But that includes impact and forecasting and guarding against things that are going to impact the organization financially or otherwise. In this case, for today's topic, it's both. And the fact that the majority of boards are not aware of, let alone conversant in, public policy and regulatory issues that are impacting the very organization they are a steward of is a huge problem. Especially this year. Like, this is an awful year to not be aware of the public policy and what's happening to every organization in the United States. I want to highlight this and call it out because we need to figure out ways to get our board members up to speed. There's so much going on that I have empathy for the board members, and I have empathy for you all. We all have plenty to do and too much to do in most cases. But if anything needs to be prioritized, it needs to be this first, in terms of bringing the board up to speed through education and advocacy in terms of what is happening at the federal level and all of the ways it is impacting you or could impact you and your organization. It can't be just you as the director or as museum, archives, and cultural heritage staff. The board needs to be involved, especially at this level. And that is like literally part of their job. So please, we'll cover a little bit more again in my what can we do about a piece of it? But even I think just showing this snapshot might be a great conversation starter to sort of gently lead into let's be better. All right, sort of continuation on from that leadership snapshot, and specifically for this question, to what extent does the board engage in the following public policy or advocacy activities? As museum, archives, cultural heritage folks, like advocacy is like in the top 3 skills of our repertoire at this point. It is so critically necessary to getting any sort of resources and funding for our programs. So we're good. We need our board up to speed. So the one I found interesting was the question of receiving information and resources on effective and appropriate advocacy activities on behalf of the organization. 40% of the directors self-reporting as to whether they provided the board this said not at all. So 40%, we're not at all providing board members this sort of information that they need in order to help us and our museum or organization. 50% report to some extent there's information. That is wonderful. We can grow from there. We definitely need to prioritize increasing and improving the to some extent piece of this. And then to the 10%, chef's kiss, A+, good job getting your board up to speed. You are hopefully ahead of the game in this current Jumanji show of a year. All right, and government funding disruptors. So as a reminder, grants, municipally funded grants, specifically bonds, levies, line items. Tourism decline is impacting this, especially at the smaller municipal levels that tend to have some sort of tourism tax that helps to fund those line items. We're also having that economic recession question mark. Regardless, there's economic impact that's happening. I've heard and seen so many challenging stories happening at the city and county levels where budgets are just drastically either over budget or underfunded or both. And that is having impact on things that are seen as, quote, optional. And then, of course, demand increase. It's not only us in the cultural heritage sector that is being impacted by 2025. It's everything. It's social work. It's taking care of those in our community who are most vulnerable. It's health and safety. Like everything is getting decimated in this trickle down of federal funding cuts, etc. So it's increased demand on what little was already there. Increased demand. And bonus in terms of not just specific and direct income disruption, we are also having the executive orders chaos. There are so many now. There could be a whole presentation on just the executive orders that have come out that have impacted us. We're also doing the stance of closure or funding chaos for IMLS, NEH, and NAEA. As of today, there's still different court case information coming out for IMLS specifically, which has been a particular interest of mine. And it's impossible to know / plan what is happening. Like, I am glad that there are challenges. I'm glad it is in the courts, but it takes a long time. It takes a long time to work through the court system. And it's time that a lot of organizations don't have. And then, of course, for the SHPOs and TIPOs, so State Historic Preservation Offices, our SHPOs, the Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, our TIPOs. My apologies if I got the acronym slightly wrong, but essentially those are the offices where federal funding is funneled into to then be allocated at the state or tribal levels. This is where a significant amount of our funding comes from, whether we are aware of it or not, in terms of it being federal. And as of today, the money allocated, already approved by Congress, money allocated in fiscal year 25, which is almost over, by the way, has not been given to the SHPOs or TIPOs. So these offices that are staffed have not received their money for the year, and many states have looked at or have already had to lay off their staff let alone not be able to meet any sort of grant funding commitments that they would have for the year. So chaos and sort of that, some trickle down examples of what's happening here, that of course impact everything else in our little financial ecosystem. Investment disruptions. So money market performance, tariffs, I'm sure you've seen the graphs, the real ones and the meme ones, in terms of stock market. There's tariffs, it goes down. There's no tariffs, it goes up. Who knows? That chaos is still happening. Supply chain uncertainty. We talked about that at like the local level, how that could impact, for example, the retail spaces for us. That, of course, has impact on the larger economy. If there's supply chain issues, then it's going to impact every sector and their ability to make money. There's the economic recession threat. So again, we've not been certified or defined as officially in a recession, but of course, any economic uncertainty will play havoc on the stock market. Then there's, of course, just less money in pots. The stock market has gone up and down so many times. I honestly don't know where we're at for today in terms of whether we're even or down or up. But overall, less money in pots. Certainly less desire to take money out of pots. We saw that at the charitable level in terms of donors perhaps being more reticent to take funding out of their own particular pots of money, because often that is from the money market. So you can just see how investment-wise it's sort of playing out across different aspects where we may not necessarily have it directly impact us, yet it is definitely wreaking havoc indirectly. So what do we do? So this is the section that initially it was like, well, this isn't, it's a hard ask in terms of what possible solutions could we provide given the presidential level of decisions that are happening. What could we possibly suggest in terms of what can we do? While we cannot impact or influence, at least to my knowledge, what is happening over in Washington, D.C., there are some things that kept coming to mind for me that I wanted to share with you that at least give us something to sort of work on in our own little spaces as we try and make our way through. So what can we do? First, get up to speed on your organization's financial health, regardless of what position you hold. Having an understanding of the income streams for your particular organization, which is like, my advice is you should know this at any time, not just when it's crisis, but especially when it's crisis, you need to understand where the money is coming from and where it may not be as much as you are expecting. This is a good heads up for you in terms of understanding what's happening for your organization. It can also help you be better prepared and perhaps even have solutions for when that comes to impact your particular area or department. Next, increase your financial literacy of each income stream. So I realize we're collections folks. We may not have majored in business or economics, and yet this is so critically important to us surviving, at least this year, if not the next few years. I recommend taking a look at the different income streams, especially the ones that are most pertinent to your organization, and develop a little bit more of an understanding of where that money comes from. If you're receiving municipal money, for example, understanding what fund that comes from, when it gets renewed, how much of a percentage, how much did it pass by in the last ballot, like all of that sort of information can be incredibly informative and help you understand, as well as have an idea of whether you can trust, to what extent you can trust that funding being there. Next, become fluent in public policy and up to date on impact items. So things like the federal budget, things like the federal agencies, like the SHPOs and TIPOs we just talked about, the executive orders, and the court cases. So again, we did not necessarily major in political science, let alone in sort of like legislative or judicial areas of study. And here we are. So paying attention, at least setting up like a Google alert, or a lot of the professional organizations like National Council on Public History, the American History, it's AASLH, state and local history, as well as American Alliance of Museums, and many others are so good at sending out newsletters or advocacy alerts of what's happening. So if you don't want to necessarily be blasted by a news feed, which I completely understand, subscribing to a few very specific newsletters could help you stay up to date, at least in the sort of current areas that are impacting our field. Next, ensure your advocates have the information they need. So this is specifically about those board members and those stats that we looked at and the grade assignments that they got. We have to have the information ourselves, and then we have to make sure we're passing that on to the board. And if the board needs the space and time and the hand-holding, so to speak, to spend time absorbing and understanding, then that's what we do. Maybe there's an entire board meeting dedicated to walking through income streams and the different executive orders or whatever that has happened recently and how that's impacting things. These conversations need to happen, and they need to happen now. And the faster you can get your board on board, up to date, the better it is going to be for you financial resiliency wise as we make our way through the year. Continued. Begin disaster planning, and that includes financial disasters. I have talked about this before, but want to underscore, when we are doing disaster planning, for museums that have a disaster plan, it tends to only cover like the top Hollywood disasters we think of: hurricanes, tornadoes, natural disasters, fires. Recently, we may have included like shooter incidents or like human created disasters. What we need to incorporate, and what is so rarely incorporated, is financial disasters. I wish we had learned our lesson when the pandemic hit. We have not. So please, please, please think about adding financial disaster planning into your disaster plan. I realize it's not going to fix anything in the current moment, but it is so critical to start thinking and planning now. And hopefully you never need it, right? The point is to plan so that you never need it. Next, get creative on which funding you can tap into. This part is going to be critical and is definitely going to require creativity because of that increased demand and competition for the resources that are available out there. This is perhaps where you can get creative with your local community, your city municipal funding, partnering with other organizations. I imagine we'll see some great creative and innovative things come out of this crisis of a year. And hopefully you can be one of them. So I encourage you to think creatively about the funding you can tap into. Next, create or further invest in creative partnerships, including resource sharing. So this one I realize is not a favorite necessarily because it can be hard to form partnerships with other organizations. There's hurdles, including interpersonal dynamics. Also, we don't love the idea of resource sharing can sometimes mean resource obsolescence in other areas. However, since I'm speaking with my collections management people, I would suggest that resource sharing in this instance has the least amount of chance of impacting you as collections specialists. The areas it is going to impact are shared generalist areas like human resources, like the finances department, like your IT or security departments. Those are resources that can be shared regardless of collection, whereas you as collections specialists are the most specific and unique to your areas. So if things get super dire and there's a partner organization in the area, perhaps there's opportunity to do some resource sharing, which, again, is not a favorite for anybody yet. It may be something we need to consider. Next, decide in advance which line items can be paused or sacrificed in order to keep the organization afloat. Even if you're not the one who is the decider of those things, I encourage you to think about and have these suggestions ready for if and when it does come up. Far better for you to have had the time and space to think about it in non-crisis mode, to come up with alternative solutions and how things can be paused or best kept whole during that sort of crisis period. Finally, take care of your people. Thinking of people first approach in any sort of decisions or policies that are being made. Just trying to take care of people the best you can. Nobody is doing their best right now. It's insane the amount of stress and uncertainty everybody is under. So just be good to each other. Create a strong network, a healthy partner network, and lend help where you can. So thinking about especially your local ecosystem partners, even if it's like little seemingly insignificant help, it can be so meaningful, especially in this time. And you never know where it could lead in terms of when you need help. So I encourage you to help take care of each other in terms of like a partner sense for partner organizations. I encourage you as individuals, find moments of joy or peace within the chaos. It's insane, and we've got months and years to go. So we need to survive it. And then continue to do what you're doing, but not beyond what's feasible. So this last one is so important because the impetus, and because all of you are so heart-centered people, your inclination typically is to give more and more of yourself because you believe in the work. The work is so important. The collections are so important. The people you serve are so important. That it can be, it's so hard to not give everything. And yet, even prior to this crisis, like we have always been asked to do more and more and more with less and less and less. And at some point, you can't. So continue to do your work, but also please do it through a lens of, is this feasible? Because at some point when things are being cut, when additional things are being asked of you, etc., that means that other things have to be cut. So you as an individual and professional will need to do some pruning of your own, depending on what is being asked of you in an increased capacity. So please take care of yourselves. All right, resources. We drew upon a couple different reports from the American Alliance of Museums. So the two big ones was that annual national snapshot with the disruptions, specific statistics. The other major one, statistics-wise, was the museum board leadership one, which may be an excellent conversation starter for your next board meeting. In addition, though, the American Alliance of Museums has some additional like financial stability standards. There's I think this is a webinar talking about path to financial stability. I did try and indicate, because AAM is like a membership paywall sort of website, which I don't love. I did try and indicate like whether or not like it requires an email or it's completely free, no paywall, or if in fact there is a paywall. So hopefully that helps save you at least a little bit amount of time and frustration in terms of the resources you access. There are some there's questions for museum leaders to ask federal grant and program managers. This is a very recent resource given the chaos happening at the federal level. So if you are someone who was awarded recently federal funds or is seeking federal funds, you should go and access that. The International Council of Museums, ICOM, has come out with decrease in public funding, particular PDF report, also no paywall. If you're super into executive orders, Elizabeth Merritt is covering the executive order impacts for museums. I think she's doing like a blog post a week. And the first one, I believe, started May 21st. So Go check it out if you are increasing your literacy on the executive orders and their impact. And then the annual museum goers data provided by Wilkening Consulting. They typically work with AAM for the statistics gathering and reporting that they do. This is an interesting snapshot into museum attendance as of 2024. So if you think about some of the museum attendance stats we were looking at earlier in our webinar, this may have some additional interesting information that you would be interested in. Questions. So every time we do a webinar, as you likely know, we solicit any questions ahead of time to answer while we're in webinar format. And we got a good one. Question. It seems that the ultra-rich are the intended beneficiaries of the administration's chaotic policies, as well as the primary constituents of a majority of politicians in both parties. Couple of questions here. Can more of them be persuaded to use their windfall for the public good? And will they ultimately realize that extreme wealth inequality, along with crashing the economy, is not in their best interest? So, big questions here that I don't know I am necessarily qualified to answer, but I do have some thoughts. So, crystal ball icon for asterisks of this is my opinion. But yes, let me put on my tinfoil hat theory that I have been chatting with people about these last few months. With all of this happening, I have a couple different thoughts. First one, tinfoil hat theory, is that all of art and history becomes privatized 100%. So this is like dystopian, hopefully never happens scenario. We already have precedent for that, right? In terms of priceless historical, cultural artifacts being brought into the private homes of individuals, never to be seen again for generations, potentially ever. Seeing that increased, and especially with this rift of actual history and interpretation versus what I will call propagandized history and interpretation. So having the collections privatized is in the best interest of those who are in the ultra wealthy class, as well as who are currently politically in power. That said, I think there's some opportunity here. So let me answer your question specifically, and then I'll go into my tinfoil hat theory in the positive. So can more of them be persuaded to use their windfall for public good? I think that question, for me, is entirely hinged on who those people are at their core and what they value. I, unfortunately, do not have much faith in the individuals who seem to have the most money and have the most power. There seems to be little to no care for the concept of public little and public good. That said, we have examples to the contrary. We have individuals who are stepping out and, for example, Mellon Foundation, not that they're necessarily an individual, but they're stepping in to help shore up funding that was supposed to be covered by federal agencies and are not. So we're seeing foundations step up. There are also individuals that we have started to see step up, whether publicly or not, for the most part not. But there is good, is the sort of silver lining there. Whether or not that reaches the individuals that we needed to reach, that one I am not as optimistic about. So whether or not they can be persuaded, maybe, but the effort it would take to try and persuade them may be so steep, I'm not sure. Like, we would need a Miracle on 34th Street type Christmas movie, or How the Grinch Stole Christmas sort of heart goes three sizes sort of Hollywood movie moment, I think, to change these people to give a F. And will they ultimately realize that extreme wealth inequality, along with crashing the economy, is not in their best interest? I think they're starting to get that. that assumes a level of awareness slash some different intelligence than maybe they have. And most recently, I think it's interesting, not to get into politics too much, but seeing some of the rifts that are happening among the perceived ultra wealthy slash those with political influence. I think they're starting to get it. Whether that is whether that makes any difference is another story. But optimistically, I would hope this would at least impact things for the better in the next couple of years. We may not see it in these next few months, but there's a better chance, I think, of us seeing it in the next few years. So, getting to my positive tinfoil hat theory is that there's opportunity in chaos. So, while the current moment is awful, and while things will most likely be awful for a while, and I'm sure there are new ways of awfulness that we will discover, I think that if we can endure these next few years, we then have the opportunity to build things back better. I don't love that things had to be destroyed. I don't love that things are being lost, people and collections, with everything happening. But our field and the way we've done our work historically, we were already self-realizing, needed to be like, we needed to be better. We needed to do better, and evolve our practices and our approaches to collections and community. And sometimes when we are breaking stuff down so significantly, that gives us the opportunity to hopefully make improvements when we do build back. So specifically, I think individual museums, archives, cultural heritage institutions, I think there'll be tremendous opportunity if we make it through these next couple of years for expanding and evolving programs. I think at the federal level, seeing how precarious and really how small and therefore like so critically important those federal buckets were, I hope and slash think that we'll realize, and policymakers will realize, this will really need to be enshrined and like more heavily protected than just an annual budget pass. So I think we can build things back stronger, more resilient. I think we can be better. But I don't love what it's going to cost to get there. So I hope that answered some of your questions. Thank you for the opportunity to answer them, even though I don't think I'm qualified for most, if not all of this. And I think it is interesting for us and important for us in the field to think about, because it is impacting us. And I think, if nothing else, it's an interesting exercise in terms of who we are as human beings. And for those of us that do have influence, whether through money or through political capital or what have you, how we would choose to wield it if we do. So, would love to hear your thoughts. All right, that concludes our webinar for today. That was a tough one. We have a webinar coming up again in the fall. No topic picked out yet, so if you do have something you'd like for us to cover, please feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to take requests. If not, we'll sort of see what's happening current event wise, and if things are sort of samesies, maybe we'll dip back into some digital collection stuff, or if something more urgent is happening, then we'll of course help to address it. So until then, be well, and I'll see you soon.